I told you that on top of being able to perform surgery on a grape, science has figured out a way to extract a singular cube from the map of Tears of the Kingdom, recreate it almost entirely out of clay, and light it up with a bunch of LEDs, some of which will become tiny working Brightbloom Seeds. Because I am science. Well, I'm Diana, but that's what we're doing today. We are making the Zelda Cube. Yeah, we might need to workshop that name a little bit. I couldn't think of a more concise way to describe this craft other than a Zelda Cube. But in essence, we are making a light-up two-story Zelda diorama, where the top layer is going to be Link's house from Hateno Village, and the bottom layer is going to be Zelda's secret cave study, which you can only access through the well behind Link's house, so they really are lined up on top of each other in the game. Now, before we get started with the clay, I gotta walk you through the plan. You're definitely gonna want to stick around until the end on this one, because we are making more tiny Zelda details than anyone has ever dared to make before. I'm not f***ing around for this one. Now, this is the sketch I made for this project, and usually I don't make such a detailed plan, but I have a couple goals for this craft that I want to keep in mind. Goal number one, keep everything as tiny as possible. The itty bitty craft committee has me on a leash, and I like it. Goal number two, learn how to properly wire LEDs. Up until this point, I have never wired more than 3 LEDs together myself because of my resistance to resistors, but today that is changing and we are doing a whopping 11 LEDs perfectly hidden throughout this craft. And goal number 3, pour some resin to make it look extra cube-y. I want it to look like we cut out a nice square Zelda brownie from the center of a Tears of the Kingdom brownie pan. Alright, enough exposition, let's get into it because we have a lot to do. Alright, so the first thing we need to do is make a skeleton. You see, corn would not be corn without the corn bone, and crafts wouldn't be crafts without the craft bone. Specifically for this craft, the craft bone is gonna look like an incomplete cube. Basically all of it is going to be hidden eventually, but we need this structure so we have something to build off of. I also need it to withstand the oven because I like to bake my crafts in a lot of different stages. So we will be making the base out of these baked squares of clay. To assemble, we will be using our dear friend Bacon Bond, which I will be saying enough in this video to make you swear off BLTs for life. I smear on a good layer to the corners and use some fresh clay to weld everything together. Now, once it looks like a Rubik's Cube that hasn't rendered in fully, I throw it in the oven and promptly bring it back once it's cooled. Inside this cube will be where Zelda's cave goes, but of course we can't have our beloved princess studying on top of the hard, ugly plastic of our battery pack. To hide this battery pack, we'll be adding a little riser at the bottom of our cube, so I mark where it's gonna go and then attach our rectangular clay sheets to the bottom in the same way I did before. Okay, so now we have space to put the battery pack, but we also need to make sure that the wires of our LEDs will be able to reach the vast corners of this cube of Hyrule. For this, we are going to cut out a little triangle in the bottom corner. I forgot my remote bombs in the car, so instead I just used an X-Acto knife and some tools to brute force my way through the clay. And the craft bone is pretty much done. This will be a great skeleton to work off of. One more thing we need to make this craft work is a false back wall for Zelda's cave. You see, we need room behind it to string all the LEDs through later, so I'm shimmying in some wire supports for that. These wires will also help the top layer of the diorama be nice and stable. Now we can start working on the back wall of this cave, but first I would like everyone to pour one out for this spool of wire that I'm finishing after 5 years. You can actually see that I got this bad boy in 2021 during the dark ages, so thank you for your service, little buddy. You will not go to waste. In fact, you will become a U-shaped support in the back of this cave. I add a few more wires, twisting them onto the main supports until they hold their place just enough for us to start covering them with extremely thin sheets of clay. Now the goal here is not to worry about aesthetics yet, like these very obvious rips in the clay right here. It's purely to give us something to work off of once it's baked. It's a bit precarious because the clay is so thin, as are the wires. After I pop it in the oven real quick, I want you to listen very closely. That is the sound of us being ready to cover up the rips in this clay. I'm smoothing everything out just enough so I don't go crazy looking at it while we're in the rough stages. All right, smooth enough to work off of now. We won't be able to cover up these edges for a while because I need them open for the LEDs later, but we can start working on the geography of Zelda's cave now, starting with the gravel floor. I made a little template for the dock that holds up her desk and other study materials, so using some aluminum foil, I start building up the floor terrain with that to help guide me. With a rough area for the floor now built up enough, I fish around my craft drawers for some texture rollers that'll be perfect for a gravelly effect. Now I made these a while ago to sculpt a realistic Blastoise. I've been thinking about making a few more because I reach for these very often when I'm working with clay, and not just to make turtles with water guns on their back. I've used these across a multitude of projects and I really like them. They're very easy to use, so I just go around the entire floor and make it look nice and pebbly. And speaking of rocks, it's time to flesh out these walls just a little bit. I add globs of clay in random sizes and areas to give the wall a bit more irregularity and depth, as most rock faces usually have. And this might be the ugliest tool I own, but this ball of aluminum foil haphazardly taped onto a chopstick with painter's tape is gonna texture the cave walls for us, so be thankful. That didn't take too long, so I smoothed it out just a bit with some isopropyl alcohol and added a few more globs of clay in areas that felt a little bit flat. Now, did you know that 9 out of 10 dentists recommend toothbrushes in your crafting arsenal? That's right, these tight bristles are gonna dimple our soft clay to look like moss. This is more for me than it is for the final result of the craft, I'm gonna be honest. This texture is pretty much covered up by the end, but I need it to signal where we paint moss colors versus rock colors. It's also a good time to test other tools out, like this steel brush. I didn't use it much for the moss, but later on we'll be using it for the rocks, so don't sleep on her. Now, the caves in Tears of the Kingdom, on top of having many moss-covered rocks, also have a lot of moss balls strewn about. So I roll up a bunch of clay spheres, attach them to the wall, and then texture them to blend them in. Now, after the LEDs, we'll be texturing these sides to match everything, I promise. But for now, I'm gonna be tracing down the elements of our upper layer with these little templates I made. You see, one thing that was extremely important to me in planning this was making sure that should you ever shrink down to the size of a raisin, you could actually reach both levels of our diorama. This means that where our well is going, we will be drilling a hole straight through both the top layer of our base and the ceiling of our cave. Now, once I can fit my pinky through this section, you can kind of see where I'm going with this, I think. Although we need to keep most of this space open in the back for the LEDs, we also have to cover up the inside of the well, so it's easy for us to slide down a ladder later. So using a little roll of clay, I slide it into position and smooth down the edges so it's attached. While we bake that, let's get started on making the deck that holds up all of Zelda's study gear. For this, I'll be using some coffee stir sticks. I did consider the popsicle variety, but they were just a bit too thick. I used some clippers and an X-Acto knife to cut them down into very small, thin strips. Now, this part doesn't take too long, but these are one of the more annoying materials to cut down to size. 15-second rant incoming. Okay, so you essentially need to make a minimum of 3 cuts per plank, 2 to get it to the right size, length and width, and at least 1 to clean up the edges, but many times more than 1, which per plank adds up really quick. All right, sorry. Luckily for this project, the surface area we have to cover is so small, it wasn't that bad. It just brought me back to the front lines of making my sky view tower. I had to cut so many planks for that one, oh my god. Anyway, after I have a good amount of planks to use, I trace out the shape of the deck on the sticky side of some tape. One by one, I place the planks down until the template is fully covered, and then solidify their positions with some super glue and strips of paper. Alright, everything is stuck together now, so we can very carefully rip off the tape. A little bit of the super glue bled through, but I just scraped off any super stuck on pieces with my knife. Now the top of the deck is pretty much plain like this, but the bottom of the long section has some planks beneath it, so I measure those out and glue them down. With that glued on, we can put this to the side for now because we are moving on to building Link's house. Now, if you're new here and the depths of my video game autism have not yet been revealed to you, it might surprise you to learn that this is not my first time building something from Hateno Village. Let me just pick you up real quick and show you a size comparison because I think it's funny. This is how big my crafts need to be when I make the inside of whatever I'm building, but the house we're building for Link today doesn't even clear the size of the front window on my Kochi die shop. So when I say tiny for this craft, I really mean it. Now I know most of you probably already have a deep understanding of the infrastructure of Hateno Village. You know, it's right next to the ABCs in terms of general knowledge. But just in case, let's take a quick look at Link's house so we're all on the same page. Despite getting an upgrade to the interior in Tears of the Kingdom, one that I'd say finally lifts him out of his r/male living spaces vibe from Breath of the Wild, Link's house is pretty standard in terms of Hateno architecture. Lots of the buildings in Hateno have unique features like their own silo, there's one with a chicken coop, the local inn has a gorgeous front deck, and there's even one with a shrine attached to it. I personally would have chosen another idol, but to each his own. Now all of that does seem very cool, but secretly it feels like Link is quite the seasoned real estate investor. Not only is his lot significantly bigger than most other Hateno houses with incredible privacy and lots of shade, but he also has an insanely beautiful view, his very own pond, mature trees, and a stable for his horse companions. I'd say the only real estate rival in this backwater town is the farm up the mountain, which has even more acreage and a lake. Now the walls of Link's house are stucco that blend into this really pretty stonework, and the corner of each wall has its own stack of stones. He's got the classic Hateno orange wooden roof and the distinct funky chimney, which not only sounds like a dance move that would make me mildly uncomfortable should I encounter it in person, but is probably my favorite Hateno specific feature. Alright, I think that catches you up, so let's start building his house. Much like the base, we're going to be building most of Link's house out of clay, and the first thing I did was make a little template for each wall. I cut out any windows or doors, and once all of them were done, I stamped them on a super thin sheet of clay and used my X-Acto knife to cut their shape out of it. Once all 6 walls are cut out, I chuck it in the oven to cure and clean up a few of the windows so they have some sharper edges. I always find that doing that sort of cleanup work after it's baked is a lot easier than just doing it to the raw clay. Once that's cleaned up, we can spread some bacon bond over the sides and weld each wall together with some fresh clay. When all of them are smushed together at maximum levels of smush, we can go back on the inside and outside corners to clean everything up. And back into the oven it goes, so it turns into one singular solid piece of clay that's a little bit easier to work with. I sand it down just a bit, not for any aesthetic reason because we're about to add the wall texture in a second, but just to try and make them an even base to sculpt the details on top of. Now for said details, we are going to be smushing on, word of the day, smush, a very thin layer of clay and using a combination of isopropyl alcohol and some metal sculpting tools to get us that stucco look. I brush a layer of alcohol on, and when it gets to a slightly tacky stage while it's drying, I use a little metal spatula to smear it around. It's just soft enough from the alcohol to get a little bumpy and gooey, so the result is a cool blend of spatula lines and that gritty rock texture that you see on the outside of houses. Once the stucco texture is on, I'm going to use my needle tool to hand carve in every rock. I'm starting with the side columns because those are straight up and down, so they'll act as a border for the cobblestone at the bottom of the walls. Most Hateno houses, including Link's, have a giant lift lifted wall of cobblestone with grass on top, and those cover up about half of 2 walls on the house. So if it looks like I forgot to carve in some areas of stone, I promise I didn't. We're just gonna be covering that up soon. So yeah, I also baked Link's house after each wall just so I didn't accidentally ruin or smush any of the details we carved in. And with a good amount of practice from the first wall, the next 5 were a breeze, so I took my time texturing them to my heart's content. And just like that, all the walls are textured. Now it's time to cover up those blank spaces with a big ol' half wall of cobblestone. This was pretty easy to make because it's just a log of clay. There really are no frills, that's literally all it is. Back by the shed though, this wall lowers into a ramp, so I partially cut that out with my X-Acto knife, but we'll finish that section when we attach his house to the base. I blended the front section into the side section, and also added the ramp up the front. Link is accessibility what is the word? Accessibility good? Accessibility conscious, compliant? What am I thinking of? Someone read my mind and comment what I'm thinking. Shout out to all my wheelchair users, by the way. ADA compliant, that's what I was thinking of. Okay. Someone get Any Austin on the horn and tell him that I want him to rate all of the Zelda villages based on how compliant they are with the ADA. Thank you. Okay. Back to the craft. With all the stones on, it's looking pretty good, but it's missing a bit of texture for my taste. So I break out our ugly chopstick and a small stiff brush to add a little bit of detail. There are also stone details on the top of our half wall, so I carve those in as well as add them on using what feels like microscopic pieces of clay. All right, so there is a slight issue here, and that is that Link's house looks banging so far, okay? It looks really good. But the consequence of that is that I don't want to remake it. Diana, why would you need to remake it, you may ask? Well, you see, when I put it down on the base, I realized I didn't leave enough space for the back shed or the front of it. Like, everything is it's just too small of an area. So I know I said keep everything as small as possible, and we are. We're just gonna expand the cube a little bit. I added a little extra piece at the top, and once Link's house parasailed down to the base, it was the perfect fit. The shed will roughly be the width of my pointer finger, so that gives us enough space between the shed and the well. Speaking of the well, we're gonna add a taller cylinder that must remain unharmed to replace the other well that I had there just as a filler. Now I'm gonna expand the cube to match our extra top piece. This includes the back wall, the floor, and the risers at the bottom for our battery pack. And here you have it. I know it looks, a little rough right now, okay, but I've never led you astray and I don't plan on starting today. That rhymed. Anyway, with this minor enlargement comes an exciting DLC expansion pack for Zelda's Secret Cave. We're gonna add on to the floor and wall of our cave so it matches our new and improved cube skeleton. The plus side to this is that I made the floor of the new section a little bit lower, and this means that later on we'll be able to pour a little bit more resin and also give our glowing cave fish a better pond to live in. And before you ask, yes, I am the type of person who needs to build an entire farm with an inside and outside portion in Minecraft in order to morally justify farming steak for my adventures. TLDR, that thing isn't really alive, it is to me. And once the floor was done, I expanded the wall using the same techniques I did the first time. man, look at that. It's like we didn't even change anything, like it was always there. All right, now that's baked, we can finally cement Link's house down to the base. But before we do, we need to cut out holes for all of our LEDs. We're gonna start with the ones in Link's house because they're all just coming through one hole, and then move on to all the ones in Zelda's cave. Alright, again, I know it looks a little bit busted right now with the discolored clay and lack of tiny Zelda details, but this is pretty much the last step before we're able to fully close everything in and start focusing on the aesthetics. That's right, it's finally time for the faded LED section. Well, half of it, at least. We won't be able to put the battery pack in for a while because dyeing via plastic and battery fumes from my oven doesn't seem to be in my calendar this week, but we can start cementing them in their places in the base. Originally, I was just gonna add 9 LEDs, but last minute I wanted to add some green ones. I figured if I put them on the top of Zelda's cave, it might give it a slightly stage lighting effect. And this also gives me a golden opportunity, or a green opportunity, to bring you along as I attach my resistors. To start, I'm cutting a section of wire because our LED is a little bit too short. Pulling it apart like a Twizzler was very satisfying, by the way, and I get to do it twice because we have 2 green LEDs that we need to fix up here. I remove the rubber coating from both ends of our extra wires, and then twist on one leg of the resistor to one leg of our LED. I smear on some solder paste, and next to an open window wearing a mask, I solder the resistor onto the LED. Is it the cleanest connection? No, probably not, but that's okay because we will be covering it with one of these shrink heat wrap wire covers. I twist together the end of our extension wire to the end of our resistor and solder those together next. Once it's cool, I slide the cover on over this section and use a lighter to shrink it. Then we can solder together the negative extension wire to our negative LED leg and heat shrink some rubber over that as well. And with that, all of our LEDs are ready to be placed in their final resting spot. So one by one, I slide them through behind our cave and use some clay to fix them down through each hole that we drilled. Link's house was definitely the easiest. I used 3 golden yellow LEDs to make sure the inside was super bright, and 1 more to function as the front light outside Link's door. Just to keep track of which wires lead to which LED, I use some thin wire to temporarily organize them. Now we can add our bright white LEDs, which will function as our Brightbloom Seeds and glowing cave fish. Most of the holes aren't behind the cave for these, but one of our Brightbloom Seeds is, so I slide that in and add some clay to keep it in place. Then I do the same thing with the rest of our LEDs. Alright, so the LEDs are all in place, and we have some clay holding them there, but I don't want to mess up their positions while the clay is still soft, so very carefully, I'm gonna bake this whole thing to cement all of them in. If you're worried about the LEDs going in the oven, don't be, they can be baked at low temperatures. Now that the LEDs are cemented in place, it's time to finally cover up the craft bone. But first, we have to make some room for Link's pond. Guilty as charged, I did take some artistic liberty here and scooched the pond a little closer to the well because I really wanted a corner of our cube to be resin. So that's why we cut that part off. But after cutting out the corner piece of the craft bone, it's finally time to fill the gaps on the side. I add some aluminum foil to plug everything up first, and then cover it all up with clay. Now I did say a while ago that the entire craft bone would be covered up, and I did not lie. We are going to be adding some significant lump and bumpage to all sides of our base. That way we can make everything look nice and rocky. I take chunks of aluminum foil and stick them on with a combination of Bacon Bond and clay, and then cover them up with more clay until the entire craft bone is hidden. Once all the new clay is on, it doesn't look very good yet, but you can kind of see where I'm going with it. I think the 2 resin pools that'll go here and here will have really sharp, clean corners that perfectly contrast these big rocky edges. With all this fresh clay, it's begging to be detailed, so first let's start by making rough shapes with this little plastic scraper. And while I'm here, I also take this time to seamlessly blend in the edges of our outside rocks with the side walls of Zelda's cave. Now I think it's finally looking a little bit rock-esque. You met me at a very Goron time in my life. I don't know why, but the saying "I'm feeling very Chinese" hits a lot harder than "I'm feeling very Goron." I'm not sure why though. But as fun as this rough texture is for the rough draft stages of our craft, it isn't anywhere near done. Since I knew that 2 whole sides of this diorama would basically just be rock, we are going ham on the texture, alright? Or maybe we're going rock roast on the texture, would be a more apt comparison. Anyway, stop getting me off track. After we give it a base of aluminum foil texture, it's time to kick it up a notch. Now back when I was in college, I took a geology class, so you could say I'm nothing of an expert. I forgot everything that was taught in that class. But I do know that all rock types do not look the same. Incredible deduction, I know. And this completely uniform aluminum foil texture needs some tasteful striations with a few different brushes. Now after I bake it, I brush off any dust or crumbs that aren't stuck on fully, and finally the craft bone is now a mere memory in our collective minds. Our base is Rockin. So now it's finally time to attach Link's house to the base. Now as you can see, I didn't craft a perfect seal off the bat because we'll actually be adding a layer of clay on top of the base to act as our grass. More like the soil because we'll be adding static grass later, but you know. The ground under Link's house is not entirely even either because yes, I did take that into consideration while building this. Do I look like the kind of person, come closer, do I look like the kind of person who's gonna forget about the big bump of dirt right outside Link's front door? Call me Pepperidge Farm because I remember, okay? Usually. I also made sure to have this layer kind of melt down the sides of the base as well. I really love that look when static grass drapes down the sides of crafts like this. It makes everything feel more cohesive and natural to me. Now once his house is sealed down, we can finally add that last section of the cobblestone wall. It kind of ramps down to the grass level, which is why I waited until now to sculpt that on. Oh, that Goron City music gets me crunk. With the cobblestone ramp laid down, I'm gonna clean up this grass just a little bit. I ended up blending in a few of the edge pieces of our grass, which I think might look better later on. And using some isopropyl alcohol, I add some texture to this layer of fresh clay. And to be fully transparent, I am doing this for no other reason than it would really annoy me if the texture of this grass didn't match the texture of the grass on the cobblestone wall that we already added, so. And look at that, we're all done. It's baked now, so we can work on the foundation for Link's back shed. Link's shed is lifted up by a cobblestone platform with a sunken-in section in the middle, and there he stores buckets and other you'd put outside of a shed. This is here so that the wooden floor of Link's shed doesn't make direct contact with wet soil. And I personally really appreciate the developers for adding in that conscientious construction detail. And it makes me wonder, you know, maybe the person who added that to the game, perhaps has a specific suffix at the end of their name. But that's just a theory. Again. Now the base of the shed is done, but we won't be adding the actual shed for a little bit because we have to finish the clay construction of Link's house by adding his, drumroll please, funky chimney. Now it's pretty tall and wonky, so the inside is going to be this little cylinder of aluminum foil that I take my time covering up with clay. Now once we get that weird shape down, I start carving in the cobblestone areas before quickly realizing that I forgot to add the stucco texture first and doing that before continuing. Now this is the last of the cobblestone texture, so while that bakes, we are pivoting to something exciting because we're pretty much done with the major clay construction of his house. So hereto therefore, we are gonna work on the Brightbloom Seeds. Now I've never made these before, so I mixed up a few different shades of blue clay with translucent clay and baked them after sculpting them into these little seed shapes. My thought was it would be easier to make these separately so I would know they looked good before fully attaching them, whereas if I sculpted on top of the LED and I made a mistake, I was really nervous that I wouldn't be able to redo that without accidentally damaging the LED. So I have the 3 colors ready to test out, and I carved out the inside to fit on top of this bright white LED. And honestly, shocked at how bright it was. I know it's literally called a Brightbloom Seed, but let me lower the exposure so you can see what my eyes saw. But yeah, I was immediately a huge fan of the darkest blue clay to make our Brightbloom Seeds. Let me just take this off here and show you one of the lighter colors. They kind of just looked white, which to be fair is accurate for a Brightbloom seed that you've already cracked open. But in the game, before you pop one of these seeds open, the tips of the Brightbloom seeds are a little bit darker. So I wanted to try and get close to that. Plus, you know, it's blue. It felt more fun. I don't know. When everything else is so cartoonishly small and cute, I went with the more blue clay. All right, sue me. What? Do you hear that? What is that? What is going on here? Uh-oh. Witness the plug moon's rise. When its red glow shines upon the land, the will to click fills your spirit. To arm yourself against malevolent forces. Knowledge of a second channel graces your mind where Diana will do fun craft things so you know she isn't dead between crafts. And also one more thing, the aimless spirits of slain monsters will return to flesh. Unless you check out my Patreon link. You see what I did there? Where you can receive an official blessing from the lesser known Hylian craft god. Among other benefits, might I add. Link, keep watching the video. Your view count is the light that must shine upon Hyrule once again. Huh. Don't they usually add like a skip button on those cutscenes? Or maybe it was a special DLC thing, I don't know. Back to the Brightbloom Seeds. So now we're gonna take that blue clay that I decided on and start sculpting them into little seed shapes. Now because I'm a little worrywart, I ended up making a few more than I needed for Zelda's Cave, just in case we break one or something. So I yanked them off the little metal top that we're sculpting on and break out my Dremel. Using the smallest bit that I own, I very carefully carve out as much of the inside of our Brightbloom Seeds as I can. Once I carve out all of our prospective seeds, I choose my favorite ones, and using some Bacon Bond, I secure a Brightbloom seed to each LED in the cave. I also used the Bacon Bond to cover up the LED wires. I would have used clay, but I didn't want to add too much bulk, and the Bacon Bond is pretty flexible after it bakes, so if I want to reposition the stems later on, I won't break anything. Alright, now it's time for another feature I knew I wanted to add from the very beginning, an ore deposit. I add a gravel base first, and then texture it with the same rollers I used for the base of the cave. Then comes the ore itself, starting with the biggest chunk. I slowly add a bunch of angular faces to this little teardrop of clay with one of my sculpting tools, and once it feels angular enough, I grab some pre-baked Tic Tacs of clay and poke them into the big chunk of ore. Now that it's finished, I actually have a fun fact that I need to unload on you about the ore deposits in Tears of the Kingdom, and don't worry, it isn't anything groundbreaking. But I thought it was an interesting observation on the relationship between realism and the practicality of game development. In Tears of the Kingdom, each region has their own distinct color for their rocks, and that makes sense. For example, in southern Hebra, the rocks are yellow, but in Eldin, the rocks are orange and black, and that makes sense because it's a volcanic region. In Faron, the rocks lean towards a pinky salmon color, but in Lanayru, the rocks are blue, and near Zora's Domain, they're so blue that they're basically gemstones. If my memory is serving me correctly, unlike Link in Breath of the Wild, part of the lore of the Zoras in Breath of the Wild is that they're sitting on these giant luminous stone deposits, and that's how they made their current Zora's Domain. I don't know. Anyway, back to the point. While I was walking around the world trying to find an ore deposit to look at while I sculpted, I saw that these ore deposits have gravel at the bottom of them, and I wanted to make sure that the color of that gravel doesn't change based on the region, because that would then influence how we paint it later. And after extensive investigation into this pressing question, yeah, they don't. It's all gray. It's all gray. It's a copy and paste asset. So, and you know what? Fair enough. That might have been a pinch too far for the developers. So I'm yapping about rocks a lot this episode, but again, it's just because I'm in a very Goron time of my life, okay? While we're on the topic of rocks, ours are looking a bit barren. Now, this won't be the first time that I'm making mushrooms for the side of a Zelda project, okay? You could say that I have a type. If you're a purple mushroom with a fun status effect, then hit my line. The mushrooms I made for my Terrytown project are basically the same size as Link's house in this one, and I wasn't going to use them for this project or anything. I just thought it's a good reference to understand my history with crafting mushrooms. See, I've never ventured this tiny before, and because these are going to be so small and pretty delicate, I want to give them as much structure as I reasonably can. So I drilled into our rocky base to make some room for their stems. While we're causing a bit of property damage to this uncolored Tears of the Kingdom cube, I thought it was a good time to add the 2 trees on Link's property. Starting with the tree in the front yard, I'm carefully sticking in some support wire to have some of its roots drape down into the rocks below. For all the tree branches we need to add, I used the thinner black wire that we used for the Rushroom stems. The only difference is I'm doubling it up just to give it a bit more stability while we sculpt. I cover the whole wire frame in some bacon bond and slowly start to define the shape of the tree once the wires are all covered. One thing I don't believe I've touched on much, if at all, is that we are embarking on a little side quest to add a bunch of hidden Korok puzzles into this diorama. So we're gonna add a little hanging Korok acorn. On top of our upper resin corner is gonna be a circular lily pad formation, and inside the hollow of the tree, we're gonna add a Korok balloon. Now, is any of this actually in the game? No. But what these features lack in accuracy is made up for in whimsy. Now, once those 2 little Korok-driven features are sculpted into the shape of the tree, we can then start texturing the tree with a ball stylus and stiff brush. Speaking of inaccuracies, another thing that won't be entirely accurate is the placement of the apple tree behind Link's house. Because we had to scooch up the pond so close to the well to fulfill my greed for a corner made of resin, the pond ended up taking the space where the apple tree originally went. I wanted to keep the apple tree in our little cube, so we're just moving it slightly closer to the chimney. Funky chimney, sorry. After I do the same steps I did for the big tree on our apple tree, I bake it to save our progress, and then start sculpting on our minuscule mushrooms, starting with their stems. Now, because these are especially small and easy for my big ol' fingers to screw up by accident, I bake them real quick to cure them so we can start adding the Rushroom caps. For these, I'm taking super tiny little discs of clay and using a ball stylus to shape the ridges of the mushroom cap. Pivoting to another tiny detail we aren't finished with yet, our Brightbloom seeds are sorely lacking some Brightbloom leaves. Around each seed are about 3 or 4 of these little petals that attach to the stem. They have a pretty cool texture on them, so I made a little tester seed separately, and once I liked how it looked, I added these same petals onto the seeds in Zelda's cave. And with that, all of our Brightbloom seeds have petals. Unfortunately, it'll be a while before we add our glowing cavefish, but you don't have the luxury to think about that right now because we have so much to do in the meantime. Starting with securing the deck into Zelda's cave with some epoxy putty. You see, I had to figure out a way to blend it into the cave without more polymer clay. I've never used this before, at least I don't think, but it was the best option which could cure without the use of the oven. In Zelda's cave, the deck kind of blends into the gravel area by having the soil overlap with it, so we'll be trying to mimic that. We're kind of on a timer because it cures pretty quickly after you mix it up, so I tried my best blending it in texture-wise, but god, I f***ing hated using that stuff. The upside is that now with one side secured down, it's time to add some supports for the deck. Now with all of those secured down, it's time to secure something else down, that being the lights inside Link's house. You see, we need to add the roof, but once we do, we'll lose access to the inside of his house. So I want to make sure the front light is in place, as well as make sure that the lights actually work and are bright enough to make each window in Link's house look good. So I take my time securing down the front light, and then move the other 3 lights into better positions to hit all the windows. Alright, so now it's time to solder everything together, and if I've made a mistake up until this point, we're screwed. We're gonna be securing the battery pack down with some Velcro, so I attached some strips to said battery pack as well as to our base. Once that's in place, we have to get the wires we'll be using ready to work with. We need to connect one end to the battery pack and have a large open section in the middle to connect all our LED wires. Now we can solder together our battery pack wires to our little extension wires, and once those are attached, we can connect all our LED wires to the extension wires. It's kind of a precarious setup we have going on, so I basically have the negative and positive battery pack wires held up by this little jig, and we're gonna fold on each set of LED wires one by one and solder as we go. Alright, and with that, they are all soldered on. Not the prettiest thing I've ever seen, but all electricians, you have full permission to ruthlessly roast me, but hopefully it'll work first try. So now I'm gonna snip off the excess wire and cap it off with some heat shrink at the end, because that just feels right. After I get done almost burning my fingers, I will shove all of those wires into our little hidden section at the bottom here, and eventually it ended up looking like this. For some more security, I added an extra piece of Velcro to hold the battery pack up, so now it's time to turn off the lights and see if it works. Just flashbang me. Oh my god. I started hearing ringing in my head when I first saw that footage. I loved how bright it was. We're definitely gonna have to figure out how to make it so our roof isn't glowing. I was also very happy with the cave lights. I know everything isn't painted yet, so it's a bit hard to imagine, but I think we are definitely on the right track. Back to our waking life now. We can add the rest of the features to Link's house, starting with all the beams underneath the roof. I trimmed down more coffee stir sticks to size, and using some super glue, attached them to the top of each wall. Before we can add the roof, we also have to add some plastic for the windows. In-game, these windows are not see-through, they are frosted, so after we savor the peelies, I'm gonna give it a good sand on one side. I cut out smaller sections of it and glue it down inside Link's house. Other crafters are not brave enough to admit this, but no Zelda build is complete without some Biscoff cookies. Not sponsored, but God, I wish it was. We're gonna be using this thin cardboard for a good amount of stuff from this point on, but first we'll be using it as an under section for the roof. In hindsight, I should have done 2 layers of this, but you live and you learn, okay? I don't have a blueprint to go off of, so. Now Link's house is not the only thing on this diorama that will get an incredibly tedious to build roof, because the shed also gets one. Now that we aren't shoving this thing in an oven anymore, it's time to build that. I'm using a thin sheet of balsa for the back wall, then I cut out a bunch of stir sticks to the right size and glued them against the funky chimney to create wall number 2. The front wall is a little bit more difficult because it has a window, but it's not too bad. I cut out a little template to make room for that window and stacked up all the planks on top of it. I secured them together with some super glue and 2 really thin pieces of wood. Now before we attach that to the building, we need to add a floor. So I take some more thin balsa, cut it down to size, and glue it over our cobblestone foundation. Alright, shed has been showed. One thing about these sheds is the roof is not flat, it actually curves up in the back. So I'm covering up the open roof in 2 sections to keep that slope. And with that done, we now have a solid base to glue our shingles on top of. The only problem being, we have no shingles. But we can make them with all the balsa I have left. I'm hoping this is enough, but we'll see. I start by cutting all of our wood into thin vertical strips, and then into individual shingles. Once we have them all cut out, an obligatory salt bay is in order, and then we can very satisfyingly glue all of them down onto our roof. I am not just walking, I am running out of shingles. I think we have enough for the shed and the roof on the funky chimney at least, so we're gonna focus on those for now. Before we can add the roof to the funky chimney, we have to add a little platform for it to sit on, and after the funky chimney is fully decked out, we can repeat the shingling on the shed. Eventually, I got off my big butt and walked down to the craft store for some more balsa wood. I cut out a bunch more shingles and glued them down to the longer side of Link's roof in the same way. And at this point, major construction is officially done. But in order to ascend to even smaller levels of tiny Zelda detail, we need to paint everything we have. The details we're gonna start adding are so small that we need to paint everything separately before gluing it down, and that means the surface we glue it on also has to be painted. Now I almost forgot, but in the game, the stones of the well kind of cascade down into the cave a little bit past the ceiling. So we are going to glue down some pre-baked rectangles of clay to try and mimic that. We don't have to add these little bricks all the way up the well, we're only gonna apply them to the areas that you can see when looking at it normally. Now that those are all glued down, I add a bit of texture to them with my Dremel. Now after I brush away the clay dust, it is finally time to paint. Because everything is so porous, we are going to give the entire base a few coats of gray first. When everything had a gray base coat, I started adding dry brushings of different shades of brown. Now listen, alright, I know I did a whole yap session on rocks and their different colors around the Kingdom of Hyrule, so it might surprise you when I say, we're not gonna do that, because my color vision will look better. The rocks around Link's house and Hateno Village as a whole are colored gray, and obviously we're trying to cut out a chunk of the map and make it into a diorama. But I'm gonna be honest, Chief, the gray, not doing it for me. The more brown I added, the lighter and lighter I wanted to go until eventually I just decided the rocks are gonna be brown. So I took my time coloring the now brown rocks both inside and outside the cave. Alright, and here is where we are now. I promise you the lighter yellow tone will mesh way better with all the green of our static grass and the blue of our resin. It'll also make way for the gray colored gravel in our cave to look a bit more distinctive. Speaking of said gravel, it's time to paint that too. Everything first needs a dry brush of a lighter gray to bring out the pebble texture, and then a nice stippling of a bunch of different colors to make it look like some colorful river rocks. And once the gravel is done, it's now time to make use of all that moss texture we carefully stippled on with our toothbrush long ago. Before we add the flocking, I paint on green in the areas I want it to go, and add some brighter greens on top. Once all my moss areas are painted, I dapple on some Mod Podge, and then sprinkle on our fake moss until I'm satisfied with the level of mossery going on. And after I cover all the areas I wanted, I flooded them with some watered down Mod Podge and paint to secure everything in place. Any excess I removed with Q-tips, and I tried my best blending out the ends of these glued down sections. Alright, so the lower part of our two-story cube is looking great. I was getting so sick of the entire cube being disposable foam plate white. Now before we get to color Link's house to match, we have to add a few more details, starting with the funky chimney supports. After I cut and glue them down, I carve the sides so they also look a bit funky to match the chimney. We also need to add the details around the windows before we start painting. First things first, we need to add the frames, and I'm using some balsa wood for that. Originally, Originally, I just cut it out and planned to glue it down, but even this very thin sheet of balsa felt too thick. And the good thing about this wood is you can flatten it down with very little pressure. So I rolled my X-Acto knife handle over each piece of wood I cut, and it lost a lot of volume, so we could fit all 4 pieces without covering up too much of the window. Then I just went around Link's entire house, repeating that process. And after all the windows got their inside detail, we also need to add the stone windowsills that sit underneath the small ones and around the big ones. With those on, it's finally time to paint Link's house. It only took us a paltry 54 minutes to get here, dear God. First, we're gonna paint all the stonework, so I go around his entire house and give all of that a few coats of gray. I interrupt this not so regularly scheduled program to inform you that I forgot to add a door. Using a piece of paper as the backing and some super thinly cut wooden strips, I cut everything down to size and glue it down to the paper. After I cut off the excess paper, I glue it down, add a border around the door, and continue painting our stones. With all the stonework covered by a few coats of gray and a dark wash, I mixed up a nice big tub of Hateno Wall Beige and took my time painting over all the stucco. So after all the walls got a few coats of the paint, I gave them a yellow wash to bring some of that stucco texture back. Once that dried, I gave both the stucco and the stonework a dry brush with a white to highlight the texture even more. Okay, we're slowly covering up the top in paint. I'm very excited to see everything colored, so the next thing on our painting to-do list are the 2 big trees. I started by giving them some base coats of brown. Honestly, the apple tree was pretty simple. It was the big tree out front that was giving me a bit of trouble. It's not even super complex per se, it's just that there are so many colors that it was a little difficult to figure out where to start and how to layer them. But slowly, I started adding more and more patches of color that felt right to the front tree, and coloring the apple tree in the back with one of those colors as well. Eventually I just said fuck it and started adding globs of super bright greens, and I'm really glad I did because this tree ended up being one of my favorite parts of the craft, despite my expectations starting out a little bit shaky. And while we had some green paint already out, it was time to cover up the last big unpainted space on this diorama. So I got to work painting the grass with a bright green. Now, as this first layer was drying, I think I allowed my hubris to get to me because of how good I felt about the tree, because the color I was going for was this static grass here, and the color of the base is 2012 YouTube commentary channel background green. Editing Diana, please show the viewer. Yep, okay. So yeah, I ended up mixing a darker green to match the static grass better and painted over that first green. Once the grass was painted on, it was time to paint the back shed, but not before we add some last minute details. Alright, first we need to add the frame around the window, and next is something really small and stupid, but I wanted to emphasize it because tiny shelves are important to me on a fundamental level. Because I have so many tiny details left to worry about already, and this video is the length of a Marvel movie by my estimations, I decided not to fill Link's shed with anything, but I wanted to add at least one tiny detail as penance of sorts, and that is this little shelf that you can see from outside the shed. So yeah, I added that, and with that on, we could finally paint all the wooden details around Link's house, like the support beams for the funky chimney, the shed, and the beams under the roof, just to name the big ones. And while we have this wood color out, I'm gonna use it to paint the deck in Zelda's cave as well. The next and pretty much last big feature we need to paint is Link's adorable orange roof, so I mixed up a nice bright orange and got to work. Earlier I mentioned that I should have doubled up on the cookie cardboard that's holding up all these shingles, and the reason being is because the light bleeds through from inside his house. Since I didn't remember to do that though, this is how we'll be compensating. I basically painted on way too many coats to firmly block any extra light from coming out of the roof. We want his house to look lit up, not radioactive. Now the roof has obviously been through some stuff, okay? We reacquired this house after the Hyrule equivalent of the 2008 World Economic Crisis. Good timing there, Link. I myself should have been buying a house back then, but unfortunately I was busy being 7 years old. So just painting it orange wouldn't be enough. We need to add some character and age through a series of washes and streaks of colors. After I detail the whole roof and it's no longer glowing from the inside lights, I add little streaks of dirt around the top of the funky chimney, and now it's time for a very fun part of any craft: applying some static grass. I do wish I had a smaller static grass machine for this project, but I have yet to find one, so mine will work just fine. I mix up 2 grasses until I like how it looks, and then begin applying my Mod Podge and paint mixture to the base. I'm doing it in sections just because I want to make sure I'm getting every angle before the glue dries, so I go around the entire base applying our static grass. After I'm done tapping away all the extra grass, I try to salvage as much as I can, and then I put it back in my cupboard for when I need it next, which might be sooner than you think. While we let that first coat of glue dry, I mix up a color for our Brightbloom seed petals. We'll add more foliage to the bottom later, but for now we just need to paint them. Traveling back up the diorama, I snip off a few pieces of grass that were a bit too long, and then brushed off as much of the static grass from around the base as I could. It was kind of a messy process, and there are a lot of crevices that the excess grass stuck to, so this took a little while. Once I was done though, I mixed up a really watery Mod Podge and paint mixture to give our static grass an extra strong attachment to the base. Now, let me run a hypothetical by you. Let's say you forget that if you don't spray isopropyl alcohol on that watered down glue that you just put on everything to break the surface tension and allow it to thin out properly, that you'll end up with a really gummy looking static grass top, to which you'd have to scrape it all off because you hate it, and then repaint the grass, and then reapply the static grass to everything. Now that would be a really stupid mistake to make, so good thing that isn't us. Anyway, on an unrelated note, here's our static grass when it's all finished. I really like the blending down the sides. I'm even more excited to see how it looks later on when we pour the resin, mostly because I blended the static grass into the shoreline of our upper pond, so I'm excited to see how that looks. Alright, so now with most of the big stuff done on our top layer, it's time to travel back down to Zelda's secret cave and refresh you guys on what we need to build. We're gonna be starting with the ladder, and from this point on, please ignore the giant Brightbloom seed on the deck. I did not realize that I had to sell 3 kidneys and my firstborn for Brightbloom seeds to despawn, so yeah, ignore that, not part of our setup. But the ladder is basically the only big change we'll be making by flipping which side of the deck the ladder lands on, and that's mostly to improve visibility for us. We're looking into the cave from here, so it'll kind of obscure our view of all the tiny Zelda furniture we're gonna make. All things considered, it's a pretty innocent change. We also need to make her desk setup, which is crammed to the brim with princess study material. She has a table with lots of doodads and knickknacks on it, a bookshelf, a chest next to that which contains Link's old blue hairband from Breath of the Wild, very cute. She founded the school in the village, so she has this adorable board where she hangs artwork from the school children, and she has a shelf above her desk with more books and scrolls and that sort of thing. Alright, I think you're refreshed, so the first thing we will be tackling is her ladder. I measure out the length on a coffee stir stick, making sure a little bit pops out of the well on top. Then I cut it into a few really thin strips. Once our main pieces of the ladder were cut, it's time to make all the rungs or steps that go all the way down to the deck. For this, I'm using more balsa and cutting it into absurdly tiny pieces. To attach them, I tape down our ladder about the width I want it to be and superglue each step onto it. Once the entire ladder had steps that were nice and secure, I very carefully peeled off the tape I was using to hold it down and gave it a few coats of the same brown we used for the deck. Now, I love detail, but I'm not a psycho, okay? Basically, all the way down the ladder are these ropes on the sides, so I'm gonna be using this off-white sewing thread and individually tying on some rope to every other step on each side. I did test out what it would look like if I did every single step, but it looked way too busy and also would have taken me way too long. So after I get a few nice crisscross sections in the front, I secure it in the back with some super glue and cut off all this excess thread. Once that was done, I painted over any excess super glue, and with that, our main ladder component is complete. So let's slide it into position and glue it down. There is one other piece to the ladder, and it's in the cave pond. It's a little crisscross support thingy, so I whipped that up, painted it, and added the thread to it to match the main ladder. Alright, and with that glued in place, it's finally time to work on Zelda's setup. The first thing we're gonna do is whip up all the bigger pieces of kind of structural furniture. Her whole desk setup is kind of interconnected, so I take my time assembling and painting the individual pieces. After I painted the first one, I also realized that I have to match them to the ladder, so all of these will get the same off-white thread that our ladder got. Once all the main poles and boards were glued down, the next thing we need to make is the shelf above her desk. It's a little different because it's held up by ropes that are attached to the wall of the cave. To achieve this, I used some embroidery thread that's in a similar color to the thread we've been using, and some black wire. I also had to turn the lights on to see what I was doing. It was really annoying to get the thread in place because the rope wraps around the underside of the shelf as well, but with a little patience and a lot of super glue, it ended up okay. With that, Zelda's setup is now ready to be furnished. Of course, it cannot be a cross and craft video without red scrap fabric, and I promise I will find a place for it somehow. But for the next part, we will be using red scrap fabric's not so distant cousin. Zelda's desk is sitting on two rugs, one bigger square one and one smaller rectangular one. So I measure out the correct sizes with some paper templates and paint them in their base colors. Once I have the base colors on, I can start painting the patterns on, starting with the orange rug. This orange rug has a few squares of gold that I definitely did not spill all over my fingers, and some random gold filigree attached to each square. After the big rug comes the smaller rug. This one feels more like a kitchen mat at a hippie's house, or perhaps a wall tapestry in a photo that's blowing up on Tumblr circa 2016. But once I'm done painting this one, we can glue them both down to the deck. Now that we have that done, we can start adding the smaller furniture items that go on top of these rugs, like her table and her bookshelf. We're going to be starting with her table, and to construct it, I'm using some balsa wood and some coffee stir sticks. Now it's time to paint it, and we'll be using the same brown we have been for all the wooden details. Pretty much everything made of wood is in this color. Her table also has a little half-hutch shelf kind of thing going on, so I add that really quick. Probably should have done that before I painted, but it's fine. Let's actually hold off on painting that just for now so I can quickly construct her little bookshelf and paint both of them at the same time. Once the paint dried, here's a little size reference. The bookshelf is smaller than a 3-volt battery, and we need to fill the entire thing with even tinier books. Now, I thought about a lot of different ways to do this, but ended up settling on cutting out tiny strips of wood and gluing them together in a stack. Once the glue is dry and you flip it around, it kind of looks like a section of books. So I very carefully paint all of them and add as many tiny details as I can. I also made sure to paint them relatively similar colors to the books on Zelda's bookshelf, so if the top shelf has blue and yellow books, then I try to keep that consistent. Now the bottom shelf ended up being a little taller than the top two, so I ended up gluing in some bigger strips separately without painting them, and once I had a nice row of bland books, I took my time giving them some color to match the rest of the shelf. Look at that, I would like to submit my world record for tiniest handmade Zelda bookshelf, please. While we're waiting for my award, there's a few more details on the bookshelf you might have noticed. We'll be using the end of this pipette that I used for the section where I screwed up the static grass to act as the little white vase on the left side of the bookshelf. And then some absurdly tiny photo frames that I made with paper and wooden splinters from leftover balsa. And with those trinkets securely glued down to the bookshelf, I can finally securely glue down the bookshelf to Zelda's setup. Next, for all the doodads on her table, starting with this little 2-drawer storage thing to the left of the hutch we added on. Next is her cup, which has some pencils in them, which is just a cut end of a toothpick, more on that later. And then some more stacked books. And of course I promised I'd find a place for the original red scrap fabric. Zelda has a mug and coaster on her desk, so I cut out a square as tiny as I could make it and glued that down. On top of the hutch is a little tray where she keeps papers, so I just glued down that. And since she is the most studious iteration of Zelda, she does have a bunch of paper on her desk. For this, I used more cookie cardboard, only I split the different layers inside of the cardboard with my X-Acto knife, so it looked more like a stack of papers, which technically it is, so. I also used the same technique on Zelda's diary, only I pressed down the middle to make it look like a split book. Once I glued that down, I took my time painting all of these little desk accessories. The stack of papers here on the top of the hutch does have a little rock on it to hold it down, so I didn't forget that. We're gonna paint that on later. But onto arguably the tiniest detail of this entire project in a very irrelevant sort of way. We're gonna be making the 2 pencils on Zelda's desk. She has a pink one and a blue one, and we need them tiny enough to literally fit inside the tip of a toothpick. To do this, I soaked thread in super glue, cut them to size when they were dry, and glued them into the toothpick. Once I freak out about how small those are, I paint Zelda's diary and even add some scribbles in it for good measure. It's time for another fun fact that no one but me cares about. The coaster on Zelda's desk is actually the same texture they used for the orange rug. This will be entirely covered up by a little mug I made with more cut up pipette pieces, but I wanted you to know I did paint it in the same way. After I paint her little mug, we can finally glue down the table to the deck. The next thing we need to furnish is her shelf above the desk. She's got a few crates and a few extra large books, so I used more balsa and super glue to make them, and then paint them before securing them down. I also made 2 more crates for both sides of her desk. These hold some aged scrolls, which happen to be the next thing we're making. Disclaimer, my apologies, for the next 2 to 3 minutes, the footage is gonna look a little grainy. I'm still getting used to a new camera and forgot to change the settings, so just pretend we're in the 1940s or something. I tied each scroll of painted parchment paper with some brown thread and secured them all around her cave. Now it's time to add some more foliage to the Brightbloom seeds, which are solely lacking beneath the seeds themselves. I cut out smaller sections of this fake fern and glued them down around the bottoms of our Brightbloom seeds. Alright, we've spent enough time on the cave for now. I need a little break, so let's travel back up the diorama to the well, which is sorely lacking in the roof department. I glued down side supports, which I pre-painted, and then slapped on a balsa slab for the roof. I added some planks underneath, and then carved in some lines to the top to make the one slab look like a bunch of little planks. After we painted, I'm feeling a bit unstable. Alright, sorry. Now it's time to add the stable next to Link's house, so let's get a little refresher on what it looks like. It's a 2-stall stable with a slightly different roof than the house. Actually, this roof texture is on like 2 or 3 other big buildings in Hateno, weirdly. I think it's meant to be a slate roof, but they should have stuck with the shingles if you ask me, because this is giving the egg carton vibes. On the inside are a bunch of planks separating the stalls with several ropes hanging around the place. Generally, it's nothing too complicated, so let's start construction. Back in the 1940s, that is. Don't worry, it won't be for much longer, I promise. To start, I glued together 2 sheets of balsa to make the base of the roof, and from there, I can slowly add all the different pillars and planks in the structure. Now once the structure itself was built, I crumpled up some sketch paper and cut it into individual shingles, which took me an annoyingly long amount of time. The messed up thing about it is the fun part of gluing them down passed by in a flash. How does that work? But the stable itself looks really, really good. I love how the smallest planks look, so now it's time to paint it brown, add some rope, and glue it down. With it glued down, I paint on some more detail to the roof of the stables. And speaking of painting roofs, next up is the little side extension of Link's roof. I paint the wood, glue it down on top of our cobblestone wall, and then paint the roof tiles to match. Now there's also a little tiny cover on the other side of Link's house. It's basically the same shape, just shorter and without the roof tiles. So I glue that together, paint it, and attach it to the base. Next is the pergola over Link's front door, which I made like 4 versions of this thing before I got it right, so I didn't get much footage of me making it, but here's me painting it and adding some final details to the front entrance before gluing it down. Once that's glued down, it's time to build some fences. I almost had a vindicated hoarder dad moment where I stuffed away some tiny fences like 3 years ago from when I made Terrytown, and I justified to myself keeping them in my cupboard because I know one day I will need these tiny fences, but unfortunately they were too big for this project, so we're making ours by hand. Now, after the insane amount of super glue that I applied to these things was dry, I very carefully peeled them off the parchment paper. I trimmed off some excess flakes from the super glue and then started painting them and gluing them down. While we have that blue color out, it's a good time to make the shutters outside of Link's big windows. Each shutter gets 2 horizontal planks and then a few coats of blue. Once the blue dries, I add a few silver dots on those horizontal planks to act as the nails holding it all together, and then I glue them down. Okay, so I forgot one piece of furniture in Zelda's cave, and that is her 3-legged chair. So I build that real quick, paint it, and glue it down. Alright, so now we are getting to an even more exciting section of tiny details, most of which will be made by clay. We are slowly getting closer to the glowing cavefish, I promise, but right now we need to go down the list of tiny things. First, we need to make the chest next to the bookshelf. I cut out the body and use our busted chopstick to indent some stone texture. I roll up a few different clay spheres for the Korok acorn and balloon and set those aside. Then we're gonna make a little cooking pot for Link by pressing a ball stylus into a little ball of clay and adding 2 tiny handles. I rolled up a bunch of tiny clay balls for the apples in the back, and some lumpy ones for some rocks if I'm feeling frisky. An unexpected addition I ended up making are some Fleet Lotus seeds that will eventually glue down into the resin pond. Speaking of the pond, we also need some lily pads, so I mixed up some green clay and formed them into super tiny dots. Alright, fast forward, let's take a stock of our inventory here. First, we have our cooking pot. I made the pot part out of clay, but for the stand above the fire, we're going to be using the circular part of these little eyelet screws and just cutting off the pointy part. We'll glue on the legs later. Next up is the chest. We'll use some cookie cardboard and wire to add the middle section to it. The Fleet Lotus seeds also needed some little flower variations, so I sculpted a few of those in addition to more Fleet Lotus seeds. I'll make one big flower later, but that should do it for this fleet of lotus seeds. Okay, sorry. Next are all the tiny apples, which are just absurdly tiny clay balls, some random rocks, goro, and a Korok acorn, which I sculpted on top of this black wire so we can attach a chain to it later. Okay, we can slow down now. It's time for a clay detail that I think all of us have been very excited for, and that is all of the little fishies. Glowing cavefish, here we come. But truthfully, I'm not very confident in my fish sculpting skills, okay? I have never done it before, and especially not this tiny. In addition, I felt like the resin corner up top might be too boring and need something inside of it, so to kill 2 fish with 1 stone, we're gonna be sculpting some hardy and Hyrule bass. This way I can freshen up my fish sculpting skills and add to the diorama at the same time. By the way, I had to include one of the goated tracks, Ordon goated tracks, from my favorite Zelda game, Twilight Princess, the fishing hole song. Oh, it's so good. I've never gotten to use it in a video before, but I'm finally making some Zelda fish, so truly there is no better time. We're gonna be carving these fish 1/2 at a time, and honestly, after I did that first half, I felt pretty good, so I just kept going. going. I made 2 more. My plan was to have 2 fish in the upper pond, but I like to make a little more than I need just in case I break it or something. We stuck wire in them so we'll have an easier time moving them around and painting them later. With all 3 bodies complete on one side, I really had to think how exactly I was going to add the fins because they were going to be extremely tiny, and the clay I use is pretty brittle when it's that thin, so I ended up using paper. We're only baking these at low temperatures, and we can attach them with Bacon Bond so it'll survive the oven just fine, and overall it's a good mix of easy to cut out and stable enough to survive my tweezers poking it into the body. While those half fishies bake, and no, I'm not talking about Zora's getting high, it's time to finish up the cooking pot. I snip off the screw part of this eyelet screw and glue down some super tiny pieces of wood as the legs. Next up is the chest, and these stone chests have some detail carved into the sides and bottoms, so I use my Dremel to carve that in before adding the rest of the details with some wire and cardboard. Alright, so our half fish are baked now, so I'm gonna very carefully scrape these off the metal cap that I'm baking them on and put them aside to cool off for now. We are gonna sculpt the other half of our Hyrule bass in a bit, but I really want to make our next aquatic adjacent Zelda creature. That's right, we are sculpting the world's tiniest hot-footed frogs. There was one frog in Zelda's cave, but when I was looking around the place, I scared it away and it never respawned, so I'm assuming it's a hot-footed frog. I really hope it is. It was definitely green, so it wasn't a sticky frog, but it could have been a tireless frog. I just think the name hot-footed frog slaps so hard. In addition, we have a pond on the upper level that desperately needs frogs as well, so I settled on making 3. 1 for Zelda's cave and 2 for the upper pond. Alright, I'm gonna stop yapping for a second and let you enjoy the construction of the cutest, possibly tiniest Zelda frogs ever made. Alright, and with that, they are about to turn into literal hot-footed frogs because I'm gonna go put them in the oven now. While those bake, let's get back to the Hyrule bass while we have aquatic creatures in mind. Using some fresh clay and Bacon Bond, I mirrored the shape of the fish body on the flat side of our bass. Once I have the body and eyes mirrored on this fresh side, I can inject the fins into the clay and bake it one more time. And with that, we have all of our trinkets and creatures back here. We're gonna paint them a little bit later because we have one more important thing yet to be constructed. First, we need to very carefully remove our now cool-footed, hot-footed frogs from the metal sculpting tin, and now that we have some room on it, it is time to work on the glowing cave fish. Going into it, this was definitely the most intimidating part of the build for me, hence why I've put it off for so long, because even the mix of clay had to be just right. We're gonna be using mostly translucent clay mixed with a bit of regular clay just to add a pinch of color. After we mix the clay, I pre-bake a really thin sheet of it for the fins and get to work on the bodies. How exactly I was going to get the light to shine through these fish perfectly was not yet known to me, but after getting some practice on our Hyrule bass, I at least knew that I liked working on these fish shapes one half at a time, so I started there. I started sculpting their bodies, but I didn't like the color, so I mixed up another batch of translucent clay that leaned a bit more purple. After finishing this kind of repeat part part of cutting their back fins and getting their general shape down, I stopped for lunch. At this point in my life, I'm beginning a lean beef patty arc. My end goal is to look like a Gerudo woman, so as I ate what I can only describe as something you'd give a pit bull on its birthday, I was perusing some more photos of glowing cavefish. It was then that I made the unfortunate realization that all parts which light up on a glowing cavefish are pretty much white, which means that I had to repeat building the body and back fins one more time. The only difference being that this time I used translucent white clay instead of translucent purple clay. Once their shape is nice and smooth, I add some last-minute fins and bake these halves of our fish. Once they come out, I very carefully scrape them off our baking tin. These fish are extremely delicate, so I had to be really careful, and I broke it. That's why I make extras. We just can't mess up the next ones, and we'll be fine. The next part of our glowing cavefish puzzle that we need to figure out is the best way to sculpt on the other side. Remember, we need space on the inside of these fish for our LEDs, and the thicker the clay is, the less light will be able to come out of it. So it's important to get as much clay out from the inside as possible. I'm testing out two ways: pre-carving out the space inside on a half-completed fish, or sculpting the whole fish and carving it out from the bottom. And eventually we got both done. If you asked me which was the better way to make it, I would tell you they were both equally infuriating in their own beautiful way. Regardless, let's test how they look on the LEDs, since that's most important. Now the camera makes it look a lot brighter. It's like blinding almost, so let me turn down the exposure a bit so you can see what I saw. I am really happy with it. I wish I could have figured out a way for the light to travel a bit further through the fins. If anyone has any tips on that, I would appreciate it. All things considered though, these fish are pretty dang glowy, and that's what matters. And speaking of the fins, the last thing I'm gonna add before I bake them for the final time are some lines of Bacon Bond to all of them. I think this added a perfect amount of texture to those really flat sections of clay, and they were starting to annoy me, so I'm glad I fixed it. I also want to confess that I did make the glowing cavefish significantly bigger than the Hyrule bass, but I'm giving myself a Hyrule pass because it was out of necessity. Now that we have all of our tiny details sculpted, it's time to paint them and attach them to the base, starting with our Korok balloon. After that, I made a fun but useless observation that I could fit 5 clay apples from this diorama into the cooking pot of this diorama, which just so happens to match perfectly with the game. Link can only carry 5 things at a time. Mr. Aonuma, please send the award for being the tiny Zelda diorama master to my business address. Thank you. I need to paint the Korok acorn next, so I paint the details on that and snip away the excess wire at the bottom. For the chain that'll attach it to the tree, this is the smallest chain I have, which will work fine. I figure out how low I want it to hang, attach it to the metal ring we sculpted into the tree, and paint it black. Once that dried, I added some leafy details to the top of the Korok balloon and the sides of our Korok acorn. Next up is the cooking pot, which gets painted dark gray and secured down in front of Link's house. With the cooking pot glued down, there's nowhere else for our clay apples to go but the underside of our apple tree. So I glue them all on, paint them red, and add some yellow detailing at the bottom so they match the apples in the game. And then last second, I decided to add a little Korok rock at the top of our big tree. We'll obviously be adding lots of foliage later, so it might get hidden, but the important part is that you know it's there. Speaking of trees, we also need to paint on the mint green pine tree decals on Link's shed. Alright, we have gotten a lot done. I'd even go as far to say as we are almost done, but we are missing two very key elements, and those are the resin ponds here and down here. To be fair, I had to wait until this point because we couldn't add resin until everything around it was detailed, but this project being such an unusual shape presented me with a challenge. How the f am I going to pour this resin? The best I could come up with, and if anyone has any other suggestions, please tell me, was to secure down some plastic sheets with hot glue. Now, I had a few fears about this process, alright, but it was the best I could think of, so hopefully nothing goes wrong. Once I take off the protective layers on the plastic sheets, I take my time securing them to the base with hot glue, making sure that the hot glue stays on the outside of the mold. With our upper pond now contained in a very suspect looking mold, it's time to start adding the details that'll be inside the resin. The first thing we're gonna do is paint all of our Fleet Lotus seeds and flowers. The flower and flower buds are gonna get pink for the flower and green for the stem, and for the Fleet Lotus seeds themselves, they all get a coat of yellow first. This is the crafting equivalent of a money spread, by the way, a Fleet Lotus seed spread. Once they're all covered in yellow, they get an incredibly satisfying paint job of blended out orange on the sides and lighter yellow and brown dots on top. You know, sometimes when I have a section in a video like that, that's like really satisfying and nice and calming, I just wonder, maybe I should just shut up. But I can't resist the urge to yap, who am I kidding? Next in the upper pond are our fish, and we are gonna paint the Hyrule bass first. Confession time, alright? No, I don't have my ukulele with me right now, but I'm coming clean. I never intended to make a hardy bass. It was merely a backup for my Hyrule bass. All three fish I made ended up looking really good, so I wanted to use all of them. But I was like, man, three of the same fish in one tiny pond, like I'm gonna get flogged in town square for that. They're gonna light up their pitchforks at me. By the way, literally no one would care but me, so that got me looking through the fish in the game, and I realized they use the same body shape for the Hyrule and hardy bass. They just changed the colors around, the paint job, if you will. So, alright, I feel a lot better now that you know the truth. So I'm gonna finish painting the fish for the upper pond. Alright, with those goofy eyes painted on, all of our components for the pond are painted now. So let's start attaching them to the base. For the lotus seeds, I'm poking in a hole to the base with my needle tool and super gluing in the bottom of our wire stems. Now this was kind of precarious and hard to do with the resin mold already on, so I had to paint over some super glue residue at the bottom and some damage on the stems from my tweezers. Next up are the fish, and for one of them I'm cutting the wire completely off because I'm going to secure it to the stems of our fleet lotus seeds, but for the other two I'm twisting their wire up, painting it green, and hiding it with some algae. Once I finish up that, we can work on the chest in Zelda's cave. So the body gets a gray and the middle section gets a dark brownish black. On top of this kind of chest is some red rope, so I'm using this dark wine colored embroidery thread and super gluing that onto the top in two sections. And finally, it is time to paint the glowing cavefish. I don't know the best way to mask the little glowing dots in the center, but I'm sure I'll figure out a system soon. Oh look, it's the purples. After I mix up a good spectrum of our purples, I start painting on the main body colors. So I ended up taking some time off camera to figure out the best way to do the circles on its abdomen, and I did figure out a way that was easy for me, but as a result ran into another problem. When the lights are on, it looks like fish ass. The paint is just not opaque enough so you can see all the streaks, and it just looks gross. The annoying but easy answer is paint it again, and again, and again. You have to paint it so many times to get rid of that. Once I accepted my fate, I continued forward painting the cavefish. To get those little circles, I just trace a circle with my X-Acto knife into the paint and scrape it off. This method felt a bit cave woman, but then again, these are glowing cave fish, so perhaps it's more on brand than I ever realized. To clean up the circles, I used a tiny paintbrush and some acetone, and when they look good enough, I then start painting the fins using some watered down paint. Now, it was really annoying painting the fish in my hand enough to not get those streaks, so we're actually gonna hot glue these fish down onto the lights before finishing the paint job. I figure out where I want cavefish number 1 to face, and get to work painting the first layer for cavefish number 2. Once I decide where I want them to go, I hot glue them down and take my time adding 800 more coats of purple paint until you can no longer see those ugly streaks. At this point, we have reached the most complex part of the glowing cavefish, its eyes. I was really nervous to paint these on because they're quite detailed, and messing up would make everything a lot harder, so there was a lot of pressure getting it right the first, and I'm done. Not a thought in that head. I also want to make sure the LED wires under our fish aren't visible, so I'm adding some algae down here too. Once the algae is secured down, we're finally gonna add the mold for this section of resin in the same way we did for the pond up top. After savoring the peelies, I hot glue on 2 plastic sheets to the edge of Zelda's cave. Alright, allow me to be vulnerable for a moment here while I get our resin ready, because I have some fears going into this section. My number one fear is that everything leaks. You know, maybe the hot glue will melt because when resin cures, it gets hot, and that would be an incredibly annoying thing to fix. The rocks and moss around the molds are going to be collateral damage, but that's okay because they're easy to fix. Another fear is, what if the plastic sheets don't come off? Or even worse, what if the resin gets hot enough that the plastic warps and the beautiful clean corner finish I want will instead turn into a lumpy mess? If you want lumpy, the only thing I have for you are pumpkins. Go watch that video, by the way. I really did make the lumpy pumpkin. But yeah, I was very nervous going into this section. When I started pouring, I gave it a minute or two to see if anything leaked, and fingers crossed, okay, it didn't. So I poured the rest into the top and bottom resin molds and prayed. After staying up basically all night long because I was checking on it every hour, I am happy to report it survived. But enough about the good things, okay? We need to talk about the problems. There were two small leaks, one up top and one at the bottom, but the hot glue did its job almost perfectly. Unexpectedly though, the static grass up top acted as a wick for the resin. So what I thought would be a really cool effect ended up being the part I hated the most. We'll hopefully fix that later. Right now we need to rip our molds off, assuming they come off in the first place. I'm gonna try to be as careful as I can and take them all off in one piece, but fair warning, we're about to cause some property damage, so don't panic, we will fix it later. And with the last piece of plastic ripped off the top part of our cube, I'm happy to report we have a resin corner. I know it looks a bit busted right now, but you have no idea how happy I am that it is finally a cube. We'll clean up the resin more in a bit. First, let's take the lower mold off as well. Once that was off, I also discovered that the holes in the deck allowed some resin to seep through. This is an easy fix since we can just paint over it. Back up top, our ugly grass needs to be fixed ASAP. Luckily, the side by the Fleet Lotus seeds wasn't really that bad, so we're just gonna focus on ripping up the static grass to the left of that section. After I got most of it out, I brushed off the clay and resin dust it created and got to work cleaning up the edges of our resin ponds. The next step is we need to repair the rocks around these pools of resin, and I ended up settling on using some Bondo for this. However, because the resin is transparent, obviously, I don't want you to be able to see the backside of unpainted Bondo if you're looking at a weird angle, so I'm trying out a new technique and mixing in some acrylic paint to the Bondo before applying it. This way, if you look through the resin, you'll only see brown instead of Bondo's normal gray color. I tried mixing in as little acrylic paint as possible since I didn't want to screw up the formula, but eventually we had some rock colored goop, so I mixed in the second part of the Bondo into small batches at a time and began repairing our base. Once the Bondo cured, I could try my best at blending in the colors so it looks like our original rocks. Alright, Goro, it's looking pretty good actually. From there, I can take the same steps of painting on some green and reflocking all of our affected areas. While I had that green paint out, I also repainted our static grass area to get that ready for another application. With no more fear of cliffside property damage, we can finally paint our rushrooms to complete our cliffsides. After I paint on their base colors, I add a bit of natural color variation by shaving off some chalk pastel, mixing in a little water, and painting that on top. After that, we can finally paint our ore deposit, and yes, I did paint the gravel gray. While I'm down there with a paintbrush in hand, I also paint over the resin that leaked through the deck with the same brown. Now going back to our upper level, it's time to focus on some foliage. I finally got an opportunity to use these miniature leaves that I bought way back when I made Terrytown, but I never really got to use them after that, so I'm using them for the ivy on Link's front pergola. Speaking of Terrytown, actually, we'll be using pretty much the same technique to add foliage to our two trees. Good segue there, script writing Diana. Thank you, voiceover Diana. I've been working on this all day, I'm going crazy. The last time I only used the sponge texture on the left to make the leaves, but this time I'm going to use a mix of the sponge textures and see how it goes. I rip off all the sponge I want to use, blend it up, and separate it into 3 bowls. Once I have 3 bowls of what looks like the world's driest, grossest scrambled eggs, I mix up 3 variations of green from light to dark and mix them into their respective sponge allotments. When I finish mixing, we are ready to apply the sponge bits. I'm also going to use up this super glue that I've never tried, so hopefully it doesn't suck completely. From there, I just take my time applying tufts of painted sponge to the tree until it looks full of foliage. Trade offer. You receive lizards. End of trade offer. Really, I decided to do these on a whim. I was just in a lizardy mood that day. I felt the walls of the cave also needed a little something extra. So we are going to be making 2 sticky lizards and a hightail lizard. I'm going to be extra challenging myself to make the world's smallest hightail lizard because I want to glue it down to our apple tree. So I'm going to take my time sculpting those as small as I possibly can. Now after I bake our tiny trio, I start painting all of them in their respective base colors. Once the base colors dried, I then went in with further detail, starting with the hightail lizard. I added some dark red bumps on its back and tail, and painted on the little off-white crest on its head. Finally, I added tiny little eyes with tiny little reflection dots, and to finish it off, tiny little eyelids. Once I got finished with the hightail lizard, the next to be detailed are the sticky lizards, so I take my time adding all their textures and colors, including the small stuff like their eyes and nostrils. Alright, so now they're done being painted, I very carefully scrape them off the metal lid. Of course, I had to show you fingers for scale after I scrape them off. I hope to see at least one very aggressive debate in the comments on what we should name them, but once I was done marveling at how small they were, I glued them down into their respective positions. We are really close to finishing this thing, but there are still a few things left to paint. I know you're all hopped up waiting for me to paint the frogs, but be patient, they're coming up soon. First, we need to paint the children's school art that is hung up next to Zelda's desk. Zelda shows the restraint and grace that I lack, because if I had adorable children drawing things for me, I would not be able to only display 4. My entire office would look like a Miss Rachel variant of Slender Man Has the Key. The ones that Zelda has tastefully chosen to hang up are one of some Hateno windmills, one of herself and some silent princess flowers, one of the school, and one of a Hateno cat, which I genuinely cannot tell if it's wearing a bandana or not, but if it is, it's my favorite one of the 4. So I trace out the size of each drawing, paint them on the best I can, and cut them out. Before we glue those down, I realized while looking at that area, I almost forgot a few things. Now, I don't have any lavender embroidery thread, but I have this pink and blue, and mixed together, I think it'll look close enough. I mix those 2 threads together, brush them out, and glue them into tiny bundles of lavender. I use some of our off-white thread and paper to make hanging notes above her desk, and once those are ready, I glue everything down to her setup. Alright, flashback to the past. I mentioned for like 5 seconds that I made some lily pads and then never talked about them again. Those have been sitting off to the side forever now, so it's finally time to put them to use. After I scrape them off the parchment I baked them on, I slowly start to super glue them down to the pond above. I also made sure to turn the center into a little circle of them as the 4th Korok seed puzzle in this diorama. Honestly, I would have made more Korok puzzles for this project. Like, I thought about a cube magnet puzzle on the cliff sides and a Korok pinwheel on the rock behind Link's house, just named 2. But I had to cut myself off somewhere because this project took me way too long. I don't know, I have so many more I could add, so maybe I'll make a Patreon only video adding a few more, but we'll see. Finally, the last part of our craft, and possibly the most exciting, it's finally time to paint our hot-footed frogs. I don't think I could say anything that would properly articulate how adorable these guys ended up, so instead, please enjoy a, I don't know, government-mandated painting break. Alright, that's enough fun for you. How am I meant to annoy you if it's just super peaceful painting footage that I can't yap over? I very carefully scrape them off of our tin and figure out exactly where I want our top and bottom frogs to go. Once I glue them down, that's it, gamer. We made it to the end. I think you've sat through enough of this journey to warp to our final craft, so let's see some final shots that will bring you to tears of the kingdom. That's the game that we I think you got it. Wow, this is taking a really long time to fade away. And as always, I have to give a huge shout out to all of my patrons, but especially my new members, like my new DIYers. We got Matt Ruggles, Daniel Erasmus, When Nerds Have Nightmares, Michaela, Milo Moon, Ali Goss, and Mallory. My newest crafters like Christopher W, Club, and several mangoes. Last but certainly not least, I need to shout out all my new artificers, like my guy Anthony Gonzalez, Hallstrom Malstrom, or Maelstrom, and Farron G. Hazel. And I'll shout out a few free members too, why not? Okay, shout out to Mr. Bamba, Frogwater, which I feel like is very topical for this craft, Cody Kraus, Victoria's Page, and Dat Worm, yo. Without these guys, my Zonai crafting devices would lose their charge real quick, so thank you guys so much over there as always. And while I'm at it, actually, thank you guys, all of you, for 100,000 subscribers. I can't believe it. I usually try to keep things pretty haha hee hee around here, but I really want to let you know that I am so grateful to be in this position and that I feel so lucky that my audience is so funny and respectful and kind, and you guys have the best crafting ideas, and I love when you finger wag at me in the comments when I do things that aren't safe, like use a Dremel with my hair down or something. It makes me laugh. I love it. So yeah, thank you so much for that. Thank you to anyone who checks out the second channel. If you like art, craft, kind of hobby slop, then you'll like it over there. Or if you just want to make sure I'm not dead in between crafts, then you can probably find me over there. I gotta build it up and sell out, okay? That's my plan with that channel, by the way. Full disclosure, I'm selling out. Listen, okay, mama's gotta buy a mansion in the woods one day, and that's not happening off one upload every 4 months, so I need a lower effort side gig, okay? All right, I think that about does it from me for all the updates and plugs and thank yous. With that, I'm gonna go get to work on the next project, and I will see you next time.